Welcome to the show, everyone. Bernardo Kastrup and Tom Campbell are with me in conversation for the first time. We're talking about the nature of reality. Both Tom and Bernardo suggest that consciousness is the fundamental aspect of all that exists. Bernardo has dual PhDs in both computer engineering and philosophy. He's an author of many philosophy books, including More Than Allegory and The Idea of the World, which is a kind of academic approach. It's a series of essays, actually. Tom has an advanced degree in physics, and he's an author as well. Over a period of years, he's assembled My Big Toe, in which he talks about experiences he's had in consciousness, as well as deductions he's made from science, where he determines that we are living in something akin to a digital program, a virtual reality, that is. Now, you guys have a lot in common, and you guys have some differences in interpretation as well. So I'm sure this is going to be an interesting and fun conversation. And for the audience, there's a timestamp in the description box below that covers all of the topics that we talk about therein. Since neither of you guys are very familiar with one another's work, let's open this with an introduction. Let's start with you, Tom. Take about 10 minutes, a little more if you need to explain your experiences and what you've learned from science, to give us a general idea what your book talks about and what you believe. Then we'll have Bernardo do the same, and we'll settle into a conversation. On you, Tom.
Okay, well, I guess I should start when I was a student in graduate school. Now we're going back to the late 1960s, and I think I left graduate school in probably about 1972, something like that. So this was probably 68 or so. I learned to do transcendental meditation, and I did that because I needed to get by with less sleep. I was doing PhD work for my thesis, and I worked on a big accelerator. And when that machine was working, you worked with it all the time. You didn't stop because you were tired. You went 24 hours, and then if you needed to, another 24 hours to get the data while the data was coming. So I like this idea about getting by without sleep. To make a very short story, I practiced transcendental meditation, found it very easy. I took to it very quickly. And I realized after a few months that I could debug my code that I was writing at the time. Well, as a physicist, we live with code and we live with computers, and that's part of what we do. We're really, I'd say physics is kind of an applied math almost. It's the nature of reality. We try to take reality and describe it as well as possible. So what I found out is that I could debug my computer code, which in those days was very, very important. I'm talking about boxes of cards, and that surprised me and it shocked me, and it opened up another whole piece of reality for me. It let me know that my operational definition of reality, which is if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist, or if you can't measure it, it isn't important. That was not satisfactory, that there was something bigger and more about reality than just what you could measure. So I started investigating that on my own. What else could I do with it, and so on. And then I left graduate school in just about 1971, I guess, maybe 72. And within a month or so, I had the privilege of meeting Robert Monroe. You may not know his name, but he wrote Journeys Out of the Body, Far Journeys, and Ultimate Journey. And he was a guy that had out-of-body experiences happen spontaneously, couldn't stop them, scared him to death, finally decided to just keep a log, keep a record of his experiences. And my point of going to see him was, now that I had this bigger picture of reality, I wanted to know, was this guy nuts or what? Was he just trying to sell books, or was it something else that kind of fit in my now larger sense of reality? Well, Bob had just built a lab. I started working with him, and a decade later, I thought I knew something about consciousness because Bob had taught me to do what he did. I was able to go out of body, to do research in that out of body state. Now, another way of saying that is I could get in an altered state of consciousness wherein I was no longer in this reality, but was functional in some other reality besides this one. And in my mind, as a physicist, I wanted to understand, how did it work? Why did it work? What were the constraints? What could you do with it? And why did it work sometimes better than others? And so on. So I spent the next 35 years trying to come up with a model. And what I did basically is I took all of the facts that I had learned in my study of consciousness, which now, paralleled my career in physics. My career in physics and my study of consciousness basically started at the same time. So about 35 years of doing this research. And by doing research, I mean I go into this altered state. I could do it very precisely, and I would do things that were evidential, like remote viewing, or such things that you could collect evidence on later to see whether or not you actually were getting information or whether you were not. And then I'd change a variable, and then I'd do it again and change the variable a little more and do it again, and then hold that variable constant and change another variable and do it again. So that's the kind of research I'm talking about. It took a long time. It's very tedious, but 35 years later, I thought I understood consciousness. And one of the facts of consciousness that I thought I understood very well is that consciousness is fundamental. Consciousness is the substrate of all the rest of reality. Consciousness is where you start. That is the fundamental reality, and everything else is derived from that. So as a scientist, I started to want to make a model of consciousness and a model of reality. So I took all the facts of consciousness that I knew. I took all the facts of the physical world that I knew, and I tried to come up with a model that would answer all of those facts. It would explain all of them. So I did that, wrote the books, My Big Toe. It's a trilogy. So a few years after I published it, I knew that physics had to be derivable from my understanding of consciousness. Now, I know that sounds bizarre, but that's the way it needed to be, because consciousness was fundamental. Physics kind of grew up as a subset within consciousness. So within a few years after publishing the books, I finally got an aha where I realized that my model of consciousness actually gave the solution to weird quantum physics. It wasn't really weird. I could compute the answer. It wasn't shut up and calculate. It was just look at the logic and come up with the answer. So I understood why particles needed to be represented as probability distributions, that was natural, that was fundamental. It had to be that way. And then I started looking at other mysteries in science. Why does the wave function collapse to a physical particle, and what does that mean? And I could understand that as well. And then why is c, the velocity of light, a constant? Why has the speed of light changed in the, 8th or 9th decimal place a couple of times, since we've been able to measure it more accurately than that? Just a lot of things, lots and lots of things that in physics are paradoxes that now I had the answers to. Where does time come from? Where does space come from? Where does mass come from? Where does charge come from? All of those things are questions in physics that if you ask a physicist, they'll say, they just are. You just start with those. And of course, that's not really a very good answer. That's almost mysticism. So I came up with the theory. Now, I'd like to present, I'd like to present this to, the listener. This is not what Tom Campbell believes. This is not what Tom Campbell, thinks is the answer. This is a model, a theory, a model of consciousness and reality. And models are only as good as they are able to produce new information and explain old information. So a model is only as good as its predictions and what it can explain. And so far, this model seems to explain everything. It explains everything in the objective world and everything in the subjective world. So you want to understand why you're struggling and having trouble and find life difficult. Well, it explains that as well. So it explains both the subjective and the objective worlds. So the basis of the model is that consciousness is an information system, and that information systems are naturally, they evolve, I should put it this way, in terms of lowering their entropy. If you have a system and all the bits in the system are random, there is no information. As the bits can find order, some sort of order, then that creates information. So a measure of disorder is entropy. And we have more order by lowering entropy. So consciousness evolves by lowering its entropy. Okay, that's a key idea. Consciousness is aware. Consciousness is awareness with a choice. That would be a definition of mine of consciousness. It's awareness that has choice. And of course, choice means free will choice, because if it's not free will choice, then there is no choice. Determinism actually doesn't have a choice. It just, already everything's done. So awareness with a choice is consciousness. Consciousness is an information system. As an information system, consciousness communicates with each other. Consciousness is constantly, they're all netted. Every consciousness is netted with every other consciousness. And consciousness needed to evolve, and it needed to evolve by evolving. It needed to evolve by lowering its entropy. Okay, now, if consciousness evolves by lowering its entropy, then consciousness found that it could put its bits in patterns of patterns, sequences of patterns, and it had a growth with this, and it gave those patterns meaning. Now, the next step was that consciousness needed to have sequences, so it created time. Now, there always was kind of a primordial time, just because change. Consciousness is aware that it can be this way or that way, a 1 or a 0. Okay, well, change defines time. But time that's primordial like that is not necessarily regular time. Regular time is more like a metronome. Well, if it could be this way and that way, then it's this way, that way, this way, that way. That defines a clock, a metronome. Now it could make sequences of patterns. Okay, so that made its evolution spurt go a little better, and then it kind of plateaued again, and it realized that it needed to have pieces of itself that it could interact with that also had free will, that would raise the number of possibilities of how it could lower its entropy, ways that it could interact. So it did that. So it broke off pieces of itself. These pieces had free will. They interacted with each other. And now these pieces are us. That's, John and Bernardo and I and everybody else out there, and the dogs and the cats. These are all pieces of consciousness. And we are part of a system. And the system needed to lower entropy. Eventually, it also started to plateau a little bit. When I say plateau, I meant in the rate of entropy reduction. The rate of entropy reduction. So the next step was to create an environment in which these interacting pieces of consciousness could have more meaningful interactions. There were more consequences to their interactions. So to do that, it created a virtual reality, if you will, a set of initial conditions, a rule set, and let that evolve by itself. When the run button was pushed, the initial conditions changed according to the rule set as time went on. So now this is a simulation. This simulation turned out to be, for us, it's our universe. It's what we call the physical universe. So the universe is a virtual reality. Okay, now all virtual realities virtually are the same. They have the same characteristics. So let's think about a virtual reality game that we might know, like World of Warcraft. And you see there's a few points that we can make here. And that is that if you're an elf in World of Warcraft, from the elf's perspective, the computer has to be non-physical. The computer has to be outside the virtual reality because the computer's computing the virtual reality. So it can't be within the virtual reality. So the computer would seem to be non-physical to the elf. Also, the player. Now, the player is what makes all the elf's choices. It's the elf's consciousness, if you will. It makes all of its choices. It also has to be outside. It can't be, the player cannot be inside the virtual reality. It has to be outside in the same reality as the computer, because the player and the computer chat with each other all the time. That's really the only thing that's going on. The virtual reality doesn't actually exist. Well, I could put it this way. The virtual reality exists only in the minds of the players. Okay? Only in the minds of the players. So we have an elf, and from the elf's perspective, both the player and the computer are non-physical, and the player, or the elf itself, is an avatar. We apply that to ourselves, and basically we, our bodies, are the avatar. What makes the choices is consciousness, and we're all part of the same piece of consciousness. We're all pieces of that larger consciousness system. So that kind of gets you a very quick idea of where I'm coming from. So now I did this not because I believed it was all the truth. I did this because this was the basis of a model that would help me answer questions. For instance, if reality exists only in the minds of the players, then that immediately explains the observer paradox in quantum physics. Why is it that observer is required before a probability distribution collapses to a physical particle? It requires a measurement, because if you can't, virtual realities are data streams given to players. A player gets a data stream and it's interacting with the computer. If some player has to get information before that information describes something in the virtual reality. If no player gets any information, then that thing or whatever cannot become part of the virtual reality. You see, so now we've got suddenly the weird physics. We understand why it's like that. And I did more. I guess I'm running out on my 10 minutes. So, I did a whole lot more of this. What does this mean and how does it apply? So it all eventually worked out to where I could explain everything, given that we are living in a virtual reality. Consciousness is the computer, and our whole point here is to lower entropy. And lowering entropy in a social system means caring, cooperating. And I put that in the general category of love. And the opposite of that is fear. Fear is very high entropy. It's self-focused, self-centered. Love is about other. So then here we are. That gives us our purpose, why we're here, that we're here to evolve the quality of our consciousness, which is the same as lowering the entropy of our consciousness. We as consciousness are one with all that is, with the larger consciousness system, and our purpose is to become love. So I'll stop there, because that's a good thing. Now I've got some physics, quantum physics experiments that I have going right now that will help produce evidence for this particular model. But I think that's enough for where I'm coming from.
I just want to ask you one question, if you can just give me an answer briefly. I just want to clarify, do you think that we're in like a literal, what we would think of as a hard drive somewhere, or is it just that our system functions like something like that would function?
If you're talking about we as consciousness, we're part of a larger consciousness system. If we're talking about we as physical bodies, we don't exist at all. We're just information in the mind of consciousness.
But is that system a literal computer, or is that just an allegory?
Well, both. consciousness is an information system. Now, the best way we can understand it is in terms of metaphors. Within that information system, there's no distance, there's no space, there is time, but there's no spatial thing. Spatial systems are part of the virtual reality that we're in, 3D virtual reality. So it's like, you can use a computer as a metaphor. Matter of fact, my terminology, the larger conscious system, that's a metaphor for source. And I use the terminology of an individuated unit of consciousness, which is us, another metaphor. So I'm speaking in terms of metaphors, and I use the metaphors of computer science because they fit better than any other metaphors. But yes, it is a computer that manipulates information and computes what will happen next according to rule sets. It's very much like the computer that's sitting on your desk as far as the very fundamental functions. It's very unlike the computer sitting on your desk, and it's that it's not material at all. It's consciousness.
Okay, well, let's give you a shot here, Bernardo. Tell us who you are and how you came to arrive at writing the series of books that you have.
Well, my background is computer science and philosophy, as you mentioned. I do not have a PhD in physics, although that's where I started my career. I landed at CERN in Switzerland 2 days after I defended my thesis. So I was involved with physics for quite a long time. Also in an accelerator project like Tom, I was involved in the LHC project in the very beginning. In the mid-90s, I was doing the data acquisition system for the calorimeter, which is one of the detectors of the Atlas experiment, which is one of the 4 experiments of the Large Hadron Collider. So I was doing that, and what we needed to do was to devise an algorithm that could look at the data being acquired and make a decision every 25 nanoseconds about whether that could be new physics or old physics. And if it would be old physics, we would discard, because there is no way you can store the entire data stream from an experiment like this. It's many terabytes per second of information. So we also don't want to discard the Nobel Prize winning data. So it's a hairy problem, which is usually done based on our knowledge of how physics behaves. So we devise an algorithm based on our understanding of physics. But on the side, I was working on an AI to do the same thing. Published papers, but that stuff was never taken up by CERN. It was too early for AI back in the mid-90s. And I could show that the AI could discriminate just as well as a physicist. What's an electron, what's a jet, it's new physics, is it old physics? And that got me started with the thought, if I can make a computer that is intelligent, can I make it conscious as well? Can I make it in such a way that its data processing is accompanied by experience in the same way that the data processing in my brain is obviously accompanied by experience? And then I went on down that rabbit hole for years. I left CERN, came to Phillips Research, and I was still thinking about this. And after a few years, you get so frustrated with trying to devise something that you can do on that computer to make it conscious that you realize whatever you do, it's about structure and function and has nothing to do with experience whatsoever. You're always working only with structure and function. And when you realize that, you force yourself to take a few steps back, because it's obviously that your line of thinking is leading to a contradiction. So you've taken a wrong turn at some point, so you have to trace your steps back until the point where you took a wrong turn and revise your assumptions and start over. And the only promising way I found was to revise the assumption that consciousness is created at all. It is not. It's that within which stuff is created. And I started elaborating on idealism, and that started off my public career as a philosopher. I don't deny that there is an external world. I'm not a solipsist. My only point is that external world out there, which we all inhabit, in and of itself, it has a mental nature. It is mentation in essence. And that transpersonal mentation presents itself to us in the form that we call physicality. Perception is another word for physicality. Physical things are things we perceive through the 5 senses. And my view is that perception is like the dashboard of an airplane. It doesn't give you a transparent windscreen, a windshield into the world as it is in itself. It presents you with measurement data that comes from your sensors. Those measurements are accurate. They provide you relevant information to survive in the world, but they are not literal. You can fly an airplane by instrument alone and land safely. So the dials on the instrument panel are giving you accurate information, but it doesn't mean that the world outside, as it is in itself, looks like an instrument panel. It doesn't look like a dashboard. It looks like storms and airflows. We are in the same position. We are cooped up inside an airplane cockpit. We only have the dashboard. We don't have a transparent window to see what things really are in and of themselves. And so we developed our entire language, our entire reasoning around the paradigm of the dashboard, along the dimensions and parameters and language of the dashboard. So we talk about reality in physical terms because there's nothing else we could do. But it is important to avoid, internal contradictions like the hard problem of consciousness, which used to be called this explanatory gap. To avoid these dead ends, it's important that we transcend a little bit the language of the dashboard and we think more carefully and more strictly about what might be going on and avoid internal contradictions. And the answer, I think, is clear. What we call physical entities are the appearance of mental processes when observed across a boundary, a dissociative boundary, but now it gets too technical. Matter is what mentation looks like when observed from across a dissociative boundary. And it turns out that this is also very consistent with the latest experiments in physics, which have sort of refuted the notion of non-contextuality, or the notion that physical entities have standalone existence. Unless you start talking about Ptolemaic epicycles, in other words, all kinds of multiverse hypotheses like Shankara promotes, unless you start talking about that most unlikely hypothesis that could ever be devised by human thought, you have to bite the bullet and acknowledge that the physical world is what is displayed on a dashboard. It's the result of an observation of measurements. It is not the universe out there as it is in and of itself. Physicality does not have standalone reality. Only mentation clearly has. And physicality is an appearance thereof.
I guess, Tom, I'll ask you, what do you see as far as similarities with Bernardo's work?
Well, I see a lot of similarities. I followed what Bernardo said, and I'm going, as he talked. Yes, that makes sense. It's the approach. See, I approached it from one direction and ended up with my description in my model, and Bernardo approached the same thing. What is the nature of reality and what is fundamental and what is not? He approached it from a different direction and ended up with basically a very similar answer, but from a different perspective. So it's going to use different metaphors. The metaphor to the dashboard. It's going to instead of the metaphor of the virtual reality. So it's going to have different language, different metaphors, but it's basically going in the same place. We see the same thing. I'd agree with all his observations, and like he said, you get that hard problem, and instead of banging your head against that, you need to decide let's go another direction. Let's find some place where you can make reasonable assertions instead of just banging your head against something that obviously isn't going to give. It isn't true. So yes, I went through that same sort of process, just from a very different direction. So I see Bernardo and I as seeing more or less the same reality, but we see it from a completely different perspective. And I think that's terrific. We need that, as many perspectives as there are, that's just different ways of looking at the same thing with different models. But it's good because it's all leading toward and eventually a bigger understanding, a big paradigm shift in what we think about reality. And that paradigm shift has some very dramatic and very important implications, for not just for science or for philosophy, but for everybody, for the person in the street. So it's a really big deal paradigm shift that's probably a bigger paradigm shift than, the flat Earth to the round Earth, or that we don't, we're not the center of the universe. We're just one small speck going around a one of trillions of suns. And those different perspectives change the way people think about reality and about themselves. And I think this perspective that Bernardo and I are both working toward is kind of the next really big paradigm shift as far as the nature of our reality and our cosmology, how things work. And I think it will be slow coming because it's such a big shift. The bigger the paradigm shift, kind of the longer it's going to take before it becomes accepted. This is a huge paradigm shift that affects everyone. Who am I? Why am I here? What am I doing? What's the nature of my reality? What's important? What's not? All of those questions get answered eventually here. And so, yeah, I think we're very similar. And I think that's wonderful that there's, the more Tom Campbells and the more Bernardos that there are out there coming to this from their own unique viewpoint, then the quicker we'll get to some paradigm shift that'll be a consensus of all of it. And at that time, we'll pick the language and the metaphors that make the most sense to the most people. Whether it's mine of virtual reality or some other, it doesn't matter. That's not important. What's important is that we get to that paradigm shift and take the majority of people with us, because it makes a big difference in how you make choices. What's important.
It is true that you guys are coming at things from a different perspective, but I think at least in many ways, the perspective is very similar, or if not the same, on a lot of things. Bernardo, why don't you maybe just give a reply like Tom did there, and then I'll get into some of these questions on free will and the beginning of the universe and everything that I have here.
I share the sentiment that Tom just conveyed completely. The more of us there are out there, the better. And which metaphor turns out to become mainstream is unimportant, so long as what the metaphor is pointing to is understood and shared, and comes to sort of be visible in our culture instead of the dead end of materialism. The difference is, if I could detect any difference, it's probably more productive for me to try to focus now on whatever it might be in terms of differences. There's an obvious difference. Tom is a much more apt meditator than I ever could hope to be. I'm fairly lumpant when it comes to meditative practice. I have had profound experiences, but they invariably have been aided by high-dose psychedelics. My normal state of consciousness is very focused, and it's very difficult for me to drift into other modes of being, so to say. I'm sort of lumpen and hardened in that way, which I regret. I wish it were different. But yeah, I got the cards I was dealt by life, and that's what I have to live with. Another difference, which may not actually be there, it may be an illusion, because Tom was very clear. He's putting forward a mythology, not a mythology in the sense that it's untrue, but a mythology in the sense that it's a model and should not necessarily be interpreted literally. He's putting forward a complete one, a system, as we say in philosophy, which spans not only metaphysics, but goes into ethics as well. So maybe an artifact of that is the appearance of a certain difference. And the one I could detect was that Tom seems to presuppose that this one consciousness has a premeditated plan. It knows what it's doing. It has set up virtual realities in order to achieve a certain goal that it has, and it knows that it has that goal, and it's trying to get there. So it is not a naturalistic field of subjectivity that acts purely spontaneously or instinctively. It has higher level cognitive faculties. It has higher level mental functions. There I would depart from him. I tend to think of this one consciousness as a naturalistic, spontaneous field of subjectivity that spans across nature. And I tend to see higher level mental functions as a product of evolution. Life is what the dissociated segments of this field of subjectivity look like. And life evolves within the boundaries of its dissociation over the eons. And in order to survive in its particular ecosystem, it has to develop those higher level mental functions, which it didn't have from the beginning. So I'm a sort of a naturalistic idealist. I also sensed some differences on free will, but you signaled that you would introduce this as a separate topic,
Yeah.
John. So I might not talk about it. I'll stop here. All this may be an illusory difference that is an artifact of the fact that Tom is using a model. I don't know.
Bernardo, you talked about consciousness kind of being, I don't know if you meant to say it was a product of evolution, but in your understanding, consciousness was existing before evolution began, or is that not right? Can you tell me?
That's correct. Consciousness in the sense of phenomenal consciousness, pure experience. I think that's the ground, is the foundational level of nature, is what there is. Everything else are patterns of excitation of consciousness or certain topologies of consciousness, reducible to consciousness as a field of subjectivity. And what has emerged thanks to life, I would say, is what is more properly called meta-consciousness, metacognition, the ability to not only experience, but know that you are experiencing, the ability to report your own mentation to yourself and therefore be able to create plans, predict future states, purposively pursue a certain path of action that is not purely instinct inspired. Like my cat goes to eat, but he doesn't draw up a plan to go to eat. He just feels hungry and he goes to eat. So it is consciousness in this simple phenomenal sense that I think is primary. And I think higher level mental functions like metacognition, self-awareness, I think this stuff evolves as particular topologies of dissociated segments of consciousness. And I think that's the contribution that life has to make to the universe. It is the ability for the universe to regard itself with these higher level mental functions and take notice of what's going on. So there is a telos, there is an attractor, but it's not planned out. It's a spontaneous attractor, the drive towards increased levels of metacognition.
Do you want to reply to that, Tom?
Well, yes, I would like to reply to that. I see where Bernardo is coming from. And if I had not had all the experiences that I did, starting with meditation, then out of body, then, exploring the world of consciousness in that way, I would be exactly where Bernardo is. And I would have that exact same thought, process. In other words, if you don't, you tend to want to keep your description, you want to keep your model as simple as possible. You never want to add any unnecessary complexity to something, because if you do, there's a good chance that it's not going to be correct. So you keep everything as basic and simple as possible. You don't make any assumptions that don't have to be made, which is exactly why Bernardo ended up where he is. He's not making any of those, assumptions. But I come from a different place where I've spent, thousands of hours in non-physical places and exploring consciousness from that dimension. Now, that doesn't say that mine is more advanced or that Bernardo's more advanced. It just says they're different. Had I not had these experiences, I'd be doing the same thing. I wouldn't want to make that assumption. But since I have had the experiences that I've had, then I do make that assumption. In other words, to me, consciousness is a system, and consciousness is conscious. And if consciousness is conscious, then it has its own awareness. It has its own reasons for doing things. And its reason is just simply to evolve, because like anything else, you have two choices. You evolve or you de-evolve. To stay forever in the middle between those two is not likely. you tend to head to one direction or the other eventually. So you either head toward constantly being evolving or de-evolving. If you're an information system, you de-evolve back to randomness where there's no information. So that is that reason why the system is active and is conscious and makes choice. So consciousness system is a conscious thing. You could even call it a being, but that's really, really stretching what we think of in our minds as a being. It's so much more than that. So again, I don't see any issue there at all. For those that are, have not had my set of experiences, I would not make that kind of assumption either. I'd have that thing as a kind of a neutral, what it was, a system of possibilities, rather than consciousness, the system that is aware, makes choices just like we do with our consciousness. So it's just a matter of perspective, that's all. And I don't find any real problem or trouble. It's not like, oh, that's wrong. It's not wrong at all. It's just the perspective that you have when you don't have a lot of experience that I have. Now, what if my experience is all not meaningful? You see, because people would look and say, well, okay, you have this experience and, he doesn't make those assumptions. Well, that says it should be, but is Tom Campbell's experience valid or is it not? Well, who knows? Tom Campbell's experience is just Tom Campbell's experience, and Tom Campbell had it and he can't deny it. It's just the way it is. So, I don't say that makes me right or him right or whatever. It's just different places, different people coming again from different directions and different backgrounds, and it's all good. So I don't see I see differences, but I don't see conflicts.
Can I ask a quick question? It's not a rhetorical one. It's a sincere question, Tom. By the way, I completely understand what you're saying. If you have the experiences, there is no way for you to neglect them. What you've seen can't be unseen, and I respect that. How would you account for what at least seems to be an evolution of mind along the evolution of life? Like lower animals don't have higher level cognition. They are not meta-conscious. But they're not self-aware. A paramecium swimming around seems to act instinctively. How would you account for that if the whole thing already starts with the higher level mental functions? Why wouldn't all life have that from the get-go?
Okay. Consciousness can make these subsets of consciousness. We have the consciousness system, which makes individuated units of consciousness. And it can make those individuated units of consciousness with any number of levels of capacity. They don't all have to be at the same level of capacity as the original. So as this world evolved, as our virtual reality evolved, and the system was trying to create a set of avatars, if you will, in this digital evolution that's going on, just evolving from initial conditions in a rule set, it's trying to evolve avatars so that the players can interact with these avatars. Well, what avatars do you get first? You get parameciums, and eventually, you get fish and jellyfish and dogs and cats.
Why would it do
us.
that? Why didn't it already start with us? If the goal is to reduce entropy, why not start with something it's already capable of, higher level cognition? Start from there and see how far it can go. Why eliminate from itself inherent capabilities that it already has?
Well, in order to create this virtual reality that it needed, the virtual reality needed to evolve. It's not something to be programmed. It's something that evolves. As it evolves, it goes through the stages of simple things first. That's what evolves. It's a rule set and a set of initial conditions. That rule set was a ball of plasma, high energy, small size, high pressure, and the run button was hit. The rule set is what we call science, is what we call physics. It evolves. And as that evolved, the sun's, things cooled, made suns formed, planets formed, etc. So this is just a simulation. that simulation eventually got the parameciums first. As that, as that evolution went through, it gets the parameciums first, then it gets the dogs and horses later, and gets the people after that. So as these avatars evolved, the consciousness would play with them. Now, they weren't real effective because there wasn't a lot of consequence there. There wasn't much to deal with. It wasn't until it got to maybe primates or dolphins or other things that there was enough consciousness there that actually served as good avatars for evolution, making better choices. So you had all this range of things that developed, and consciousness didn't just ignore it, but played with it as it evolved. Now, dogs and cats and horses are conscious. They have choices. They're not just instinctual. They have feelings and emotions. They think into the future. They are aware of the past. They are just like we are, but they have lesser. They have a lesser capacity. Their capacity to choose is smaller, and I call this decision space. They have a smaller decision space, which is all the choices that they would have to make. We have a larger decision space. Now, dolphins may have bigger brains than we do, but we have the larger decision space because of these opposable thumbs, and we're out here and we can build and construct and do all sorts of things that dolphins can't do. So that gives us more things that we can do, a larger decision space. So decision space evolved naturally with the evolution of the virtual reality. And that's why you have consciousness at all these various levels, because the small things came first and built their way up. And, I think we could have a real interesting conversation about that conscious computer that you were talking about early on in your thing, because from my viewpoint, I come at it very differently. And I think a conscious computer is a thing that we'll see, but it's not going to be programmed, and it's not going to be, the consciousness isn't going to be made from isn't going to be produced, because you don't produce consciousness. It's not that way. But if you have a platform that has the capability of being a useful avatar, then consciousness can log on to it and use it as an avatar, just like it logs on to, this virtual body, this avatar that we call a human being, or the dog or the cat. It can log on to that other avatar that's silicon-based rather than carbon-based like us. And now you will have a computer that's conscious, but not because you created the consciousness, but because the consciousness system logged on, and a individuated unit of consciousness logged on to that silicon-based avatar because it was a worthy avatar with worthy choices. But now if all it does is play chess, that's not necessarily worthy choices. It's very narrow. The decision space is a very narrow set. If it makes moral and ethical choices, then perhaps that's an avatar that is worthy of conscious logging onto. So that's how one ends up with a conscious computer, not because you can compute consciousness, but because you can produce a worthy avatar that consciousness would play in.
I think that, at least for me, one of the most important questions that come up with all this stuff is that how are we all connected? I know, Bernardo, you think that we're probably, one mind in a sense, and through something called dissociative identity disorder, we kind of fragment and have different perspectives. I'm not sure exactly what you think on this, Tom, but Bernardo, why don't you fill us in on how you think that every, conscious agent is really fundamentally one conscious agent?
Yeah, the three main metaphysical options on the table today are physicalism, panpsychism, and idealism. Each one of them faces a fundamental problem. Two of them an impossible problem. So for physicalism, it's the hard problem of consciousness. There's nothing about physical parameters in terms of which you could deduce the qualities of experience. It's an impassable gap there. For panpsychism, it's the combination problem. If consciousness is fundamental in elementary subatomic particles, how do those gazillions of fundamentally separate fields of subjectivity combine to form my unitary conscious inner life? There are good arguments that this falls into contradiction as well. It's a fundamentally insoluble problem. And then idealism, it's the decomposition problem. If everything starts from one mind, how come I can't read your thoughts or know what's going on in the galaxy of Andromeda right now? If I'm part of just one mind, then I should have access to everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, so how do we account for that? There is a very clear empirical way to account for that. Psychiatry in the 21st century has now proven that dissociation can be as strong as to make you literally blind to what's happening around you, even if your eyes are closed. That's research from Germany in 2015. So we know dissociation is a real phenomenon that can create seemingly separate centers of awareness within a person. So the only step we need to make is an inferential step. We extrapolate that to reality as a whole. And we say, well, this one consciousness undergoes naturally, not as a disorder. The disorder is just a metaphor, but it naturally undergoes, of the many processes it can undergo, one of them is dissociation. And what the dissociative process in universal consciousness looks like is what we call life, is biology, metabolism. That's what it looks like. And we don't need a brain scanner to look at it because we don't need to see through a skull. We are already inside the system. So we just look around and dissociative processes look like life, biology. So that's the very empirical way to address the decomposition problem of idealism.
Okay. Can I have a comment on that?
Sure.
John?
Yeah, sure.
The comment I would have is the idea that there's a problem, because if it's all one consciousness, why don't we know what's going on in Andromeda or here, there, and everywhere? Because if it's all one consciousness and it's all connected, then we should have all that knowledge. And my answer to that is we do. We obviously do. All of that information is available. It's not that is a problem or a failure. It is available, but it's not available to the intellect. It's available to the intuition. All of the things that are, we have this word paranormal, which basically just means beyond normal, which actually means beyond materialism from the viewpoint of our culture today. And so these things that are beyond materialism that we call paranormal, all of those things happen on the intuitive side. None of them can happen in the intellectual side. And in the intuitive side is where you can take that intuitive side and develop it to the point that it is just as reliable and just as accurate as the intellectual side. In our culture, almost nobody does that. For us, in our Western culture, the intuitive side is almost a throwaway because, well, you can't depend on it. Sometimes it works. Sometimes, your gut feelings are good. Sometimes they're wrong. Mm-hmm. And it's nothing that you could depend on. So it's really a throwaway kind of thing. Artists and people who, are creative tend to get more into that side. But that's kind of a woo-woo space that we can't block out into nice little logical steps. Well, you can develop that intuitive side just like you can develop your intellectual side. And when you do, that information is together. All consciousness is connected. Now, it's not that, it's connected in the same way that I'd say all the sites on the internet are connected. It's not that you see every site on the internet all at once, but you can focus. You can use your intent to open up a connection or close a connection, just like you do on the internet. So it's all available, but you have to be able to make the connection. You have to be able to get that, to get that URL and click on it and have it come up. And you can just as easily, click on the X in the upper right-hand corner and make it go away. Now, that's all just metaphor to get the idea across. But basically, you do have control, and you can find that information if you wish. For the most part, that information is not particularly useful, because things that are useful are things that we can use here in this virtual reality we call our physical universe. If it's not useful here, if it's not something that you can apply, if it's not something that's part of what's happening here, then it's kind of useless information. So it is available. We can speak mind to mind. We do have an opportunity to understand other people's feelings and what other people are thinking and seeing through another person's eyes. Empathy is where we pick up what other people's, emotional states, and it's a caring does that. So it just takes the time to develop that intuitive side, and everybody can develop it. It's not that anybody's locked out from it. What makes it hard for us to develop it is that our intellectual side is dominant, and our intellectual side wants to butt in and take charge and analyze. And in the intuitive side, analysis and judgments and comparisons just kill the process. That belongs on the intellectual side. On the intuitive side, you just know. Now, if you just know, well, how do you know you know? And how do you know you're not just making it up, right? It's just, an idea. Well, that only comes with experience, because a lot of the things that you can know can be evidential. Some of them are not. So if they're not evidential, then you never know that you know. Mm-hmm. It's impossible to know for sure whether, I could get a little more in detail about that, but you never know for sure where the information's coming from. There's three sources that come to your consciousness. One is yourself, your own imagination. You can make things up. Your consciousness, you can create information. The other one is from some other individuated unit of consciousness, because we're all connected. And the last is from the system itself. But there's no tags on any of those. You never know which one it is. So it could, in fact, always be your imagination, you see. But with experience, if you experience enough of these communications and you get enough evidential information back, then you know that it's not just, but you do have those three because you've experienced all three of them, and you get a sense of each one of those three. Although you're never 100% sure, you get a pretty good idea. Just like on a telephone call, you pick it up and it sounds like it's your mother. Well, you're pretty sure because you really know her voice, but you're not 100% sure because somebody else could either mimic that voice or have a very similar voice. So you're never 100%. So that's, so that would be my answer to that problem of the idea that why don't you know everything? Well, you can, but for the most part, it's not all that useful, except for those things that relate to here, and then it can be useful. But for the most part, we're here to interact, learn, make choices, and therefore evolve. So all of that kind of becomes irrelevant and not particularly significant.
I want to hear Bernardo's reply to that if he wants to say something, but if you could take maybe just another minute or two here. You're talking about access to information and everything, and I know that you don't like to get deeply into detail about what happens with you when you meditate and whatnot, but maybe you could just tell us a little bit about, what happens when you meditate. I know that Bernardo's had some experiences that were kind of extraordinary, and I'd like to know what you guys make of that kind of thing. So what can you access, and what really happens with someone like you in meditation?
Well, you start with meditation because the first thing you need to do is gain some discipline over your thoughts. That's the first place. And meditation is basically a process of gaining discipline. You try to make all of your thoughts go away to where you just have no thoughts. You just are awareness. You exist because you're aware. The next step then is to let your sense data go. So you're not really thinking about your five sense data. You just kind of let it go. So if you have discipline to where things don't come in your mind randomly, you can control that. You have the discipline of your mind. And if you can let go all of your sense data, well, now you are in an intuitive space. You're no longer here because the sense data defines here as this virtual reality. Our virtual reality is defined in terms of our sense data. So now you are someplace else. And where you are is in that larger consciousness system. Now, all of that initially takes a long time, and it takes a lot of process in that, the meditation isn't something most people learn overnight. It takes a long time to do that. But eventually you get to the point that you do have the discipline and you do have the experience. And then the meditation to getting information is very quick and very trivial, just like the out of body, getting into that state where you're no longer here that I just described because you're not getting sense data and you're not having intrusive thoughts. Well, you can do that in a tenth of a second. You don't have to go through all the process. So you just take that intuitive part of you and you have an intent for the information, and there it is. It just is there. It comes to you. You just know because you're a part of consciousness. And like he says, consciousness, is one whole system. We're all part of that same consciousness. So you want to look into the past and see what happened, 1,000 years ago. You want to look into the probable future because the future doesn't exist yet because we haven't made the choices to create it. Then you can do that. If you, you want to know what's going on in some other, star system or some other virtual reality that is not part of this physical universe, you can do that too. So it's just a matter of changing the focus, changing your intention, changing the data stream that you're connected to. So we're connected to this data stream. We call it a physical reality. You just connect to a different data stream. You can do it in fractions of a second, and there you are. And eventually you can learn to parallel process where some part of you's here getting this data stream. There's another part of you there getting that data stream. Sort of like bringing up The Sims and World of Warcraft, both, on two computers that are both sitting on your desk. You can't actually play them both at the same time, but you can play this one a little and play that one a little, and you can see both of them and keep track of what's going on. So that's how that works. It gets to become, that intuitive side gets to become a very simple process as you develop it, but it takes time to develop it. Now, I have been in kind of a, full court press on developing this since, 1960s. So I've got 40 years in of working on developing this side. So that's, so for me, it's a simple thing. A lot of people struggle, but for everybody, it can become a simple thing and everybody can learn to do it. It's actually not that you have to learn something new. You just have to drop things that are getting in the way. So it's not like a new technique. It's just getting rid of the things that get in your way from doing it. Your beliefs, getting rid of all your beliefs is a key thing, and getting the intellect to sit down and be quiet. That's just mental discipline.
You want to reply to that, Bernardo?
Yeah, just a brief comment. Look, I would love to think that idealism doesn't have a problem it needs to tackle. I mean, it would be fantastic, but I do think it has. Even if we ignore the intellect for a moment and we think about only our emotional inner life, I can't feel the emotions of every living being on the universe at the same time right now. There is something that doesn't allow that to happen. And even if it can happen, if I apply the right techniques, then I'm learning to overcome some form of limitation that has naturally arisen by the mere fact that I was born. Idealism has to make sense of the fact that we aren't all fully omniscient all the time. Now, I'm very sympathetic to the possibility that we can reduce the dissociative level through applied technique. I'm very open to the possibility that I am lumpen in this regard, but other people are a lot more talented. I'm more than open to that. I'm pretty sure that is the case. But I don't think we can get away with just saying, well, there is no problem that needs to be clarified and needs to be made sense of. I think very clearly there is.
Yeah, I would agree with you. We're not all omniscient all the time. That's true. I'm not omniscient ever, much less all the time. That's not the point. But I can get that information. I can make that connection if I want to. So it's not that everything is available all the time, like all the websites in the world. I don't know how many there are now, but there's probably several billion websites. And I don't get all the websites all at the same time, but they're all there and I can get them as I want to. I can open them and close them. So it's sort of like that. Now, omniscience, you'd have to get all of them all the time. Now that would make you omniscient as far as the web goes. You'd know everything going on in the web all at the same time. But that's kind of I don't even think the system does that. I don't think there's any point in it. I don't know that there's any reason that it would need to or want to, but you can focus on various things using your intent and open and close them. So omniscience, no, nothing all the time. They come and go as you want, but you can understand how another person is feeling. You can even see the world through their eyes. It's just, that's possible. But you're not going to do that even with 10 people, much less 8 billion of them. You're going to do that with one at a time because it's a full experience. It completely fills up your experience. You can parallel process a little, but parallel processing has its limitations. You can parallel process 2 different streams, data streams, and 3 and 4, and you can sometimes, at least that's just my experience, I can sometimes maybe, if they're simple, even do 5, but then you're done. So this idea of doing everything at once, no, you can't do everything at once. You can just do a little tiny piece of it at a time.
Your metaphor gives you a language that allows you to handle the problem. But again, it is a metaphor. I think we are both saying that ultimately it's one mind.
Yes.
And if that is the hypothesis we are putting forward, we have to understand why this one mind is not fully omniscient. Because if I imagine myself as being a separate mind, I seem to be conscious of everything that I am experiencing right now. And if I am not, that's because I'm dissociated from parts of my own mind. That's what we know from psychology. So again, dissociation comes in. But insofar as I'm not dissociated, I seem to be concurrently conscious of all the contents of my mind all at once. So why isn't that the case at a universal level? In which case, you and I wouldn't need this computer to exchange information. The fact that we seem to, at least I do, shows that there is something going on that needs to be accounted for, I think.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, if we were to just have a telepathic communication, if you and I were to do that, it wouldn't be the same as this. This is something different. Our telepathic communication would be more in terms of feeling, more in terms of bigger picture things, more metaphorical. This can be very detailed. This can be very, precise. Like it'd be a lot of trouble. Now I'm just talking about my own experience, so my experience is limited and my capacity with my consciousness is limited. As much as I have noticed and interacted with the system itself, the larger consciousness system, I don't think it is aware of everything that's a part of itself. I don't think it's aware of everything all the time because I've noticed that there are things that it seems to not be aware of until it puts its attention on it. But it can do a whole lot more than I can. I maybe only can juggle, 5 different parallel things at a time. It can probably do tens of thousands, but I'm just a little piece of that consciousness. I don't have that capacity. And I have a lot more capacity than my dog does. My dog has a capacity to think various thoughts, to have a couple of things going on in its mind at once, but it cannot process as many things and see as deeply into things and get the detail of things that I see. It doesn't do that. Its capacity is not there. So my capacity isn't anywhere near the system's capacity, but even the system isn't aware. Awareness has to do with intent. You put your awareness on things. So yes, you can go into what's the old metaphor for awareness? You're in a room and it's totally black and you have a flashlight. So your awareness illuminates a particular piece of it, and that's what you're aware of, but you're not thinking about any of the rest of it, so you're not aware of it. And even if the lights are on, that's true. You're only aware of certain things that you focus your attention on. And I think that is a fundamental characteristic of awareness, is that it isn't omniscient, it's focused, it's pointed, it's directed. And the larger consciousness system, though it's aware of a lot more than I can conceive of, it's not aware of everything all the time. It's not that kind of omniscient thing. It's also not infinite. It's also not perfect. It's just a natural, it's not supernatural. It's a natural system that exists and has evolved. And it's evolved to being what it is, and it's still evolving. It's not done. It's still evolving. So I see it as a natural evolving system, but it also has to focus if it wants details.
I want to move on to free will here, but I want to ask you a question, Bernardo, just to kind of get your perspective. Let's say that there were two people, they went into a room together, and they both consumed something like psilocybin, and both of those people kind of managed to, partially breach the dissociative boundary. Could those people have some kind of merging with one another in some way, or in your idea, would that not be possible?
I have never had that experience. I have heard reports of experiences like that. I would not discount that as impossible. I think it probably is possible from a theoretical perspective. I think it is possible. At the same time, I would be. I'm not skeptical. I'm just careful about psychedelic gnosis, because to me at least, the greatest lesson from psychedelics was that the first or the prime directive of mind is to deceive itself. Your mind will try to deceive itself left and right, and it will use incredibly sophisticated techniques to deceive itself. And that's what I took back from a psychedelic experience. I was deceiving myself there. What does that mean? That means that I might be deceiving myself right now, because it's the same mind running on serotonin right now, and back there it was running on psilocybin. Very, very similar molecules. We are on drugs all the time. So for me, that's the lesson to take back, is your mind is always trying to deceive yourself. Right here, right now as well. I have been in psychedelic spaces that had a irresistible sense of hyper reality, of something that is a lot more real than this is right now. And is it a cognitive hallucination? Probably, because my body was still lying on my bed while I was having that sense of hyper reality. But to me, what it means is you have to be skeptical of this right now. You have to be skeptical of your references. Your mind is most likely deceiving you right now, not because it is deceptive in intent, not because it has bad ethics, but because it's just what it is. It does what it does because it is what it is. It is the nature of mind to do this kind of stuff. So for me, that's the biggest lesson, and not to return from a psychedelic trip with a sophisticated theory about the aliens in the Pleiades changing our heart vibrations from the galactic center, whatever. You have to be very careful about psychedelic gnosis.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Matter of fact, one of the things that's kind of, my bywords is that you need to be skeptical of everything. And the person you need to be most skeptical of is yourself. And that, I think, I talk about open-minded skepticism, is the only way to move forward. And skepticism is necessary. But I could give a little different viewpoint of that also, in that the reason that we need to be so skeptical of ourselves is because of the fear that we have. That fear generates what we call ego. Ego is awareness in the service of fear rather than awareness in service of love. So that ego and that fear also creates a lot of beliefs. And in as much as you have belief or ego, then you are indeed constantly trying to deceive yourself, to justify those beliefs, to cover up those fears. But if you get rid of that, and the fear and the belief and the ego are all high entropy things. If you evolve your consciousness to a lower entropy, to where you minimize that fear, which minimizes the ego, minimizes the beliefs, then you find that the mind isn't always trying to deceive you. It's only deceiving you to the degree that you have fear and that you have ego and that you have beliefs. It is possible to offload most of that, but you still need to be skeptical, because I'm not sure you can always offload all of it and keep it offloaded. I'd be skeptical of that too. So I agree with you. Skepticism has to be right up front, and it has to be on everything. But it's tied to the fear, the ego, and the beliefs that we have. That's what makes the mind so tricky. That's what makes it so false, because it's got these things it's trying to justify. It's got issues. It wants to feel. It wants this to be true, whether it is or not, or it doesn't want that to be true. It's got a dog in the fight, as they say. It's got expectations, and all of that stuff makes it come up with erroneous conclusions. And the results of drug trips, when you take a drug to get into that larger, to get out of this reality and into another, indeed, the experience is real. You do get into another reality. That's true. But it's generally just out of control, because you haven't gotten there organically on your own. And if you don't get there organically on your own, then it's what if you had an experience and you just suddenly ended up in a small village in China? It's just, here you are, sitting in a diner in New York with your friends, and the next instant you're sitting in a small village in China. Well, you would be very disoriented, and you would say, wow, this is really interesting, but what in the heck is going on here? And you wouldn't speak the language, you wouldn't know any of the customs, you wouldn't know where you were, and you just kind of experience it, but it would be disconnected from everything. It's just a disconnected set of experiences. Whereas if you go under your own power, not with a drug, you have to map it all out. You have to experience it, and you gradually grow in the breadth of your experience. And it does then make sense. You understand, oh, okay, I'm in China now. That's a little village, and it's just the Sean Wen family. All right, yeah, hi, Sean, hi, Wen, yeah. So that's the difference. It's the difference in being able to function there, as opposed to just look around and go, gee whiz, isn't this amazing? So it's just the big difference, but it's real in either case. And yes, of course you could communicate with another being while you were in that, or while you were just in the meditation.
Many physicalists would say that we're in a system of things, and this system that we're experiencing is entirely dependent on rules. And at the moment of the Big Bang, that hot ball of plasma started expanding, and at that very moment, everything that would ever happen was set in stone. This very conversation is a result of the physics from the Big Bang. I know that a lot of people would say that if this is a computer simulation, computers are, entirely dependent on rules, so there's no room for free will. What do you think, Bernardo, on free will? Is it a real thing that we experience it? Are we experiencing it maybe partially in some way, or is it not a thing?
I think it's largely a red herring, the whole discussion. Let me try to address that systematically. It is impossible to deny that nature behaves according to certain regularities that we metaphorically refer to as the laws of nature. If I release an object from my hand, it will fall. That's a regularity that we can rely on, and we develop technology around our knowledge of these regularities, technology that usually works. The question is, do we know all of these regularities? And the answer is obviously we don't. And we are fundamentally prejudiced against non-local regularities because they cannot be studied under controlled laboratory conditions. Maybe there are certain organizing principles in nature that only kick in at a certain degree of complexity. When there are enough elements in the system with a given structure, then that organizing principle kicks in. Can we find those by looking at experiments inside a laboratory under controlled conditions? Of course not. It's too many variables, too much complexity to control. So we are sort of methodologically blind to those potential organizing principles. And if we knew what they are, maybe it would come closer to our intuition of free will. Jung and Pauli refer to those possible principles as synchronicities, correspondences of form. And with the word form, I mean it in the broadest sense possible, even correspondences of cognitive meaning. Now, that's one point. The other point is that our intuition of free will seems to try to find the space somewhere in between determinism and randomness. When we talk about free will, we don't mean determinism, but we also don't mean randomness. My free-willed choices don't seem to be random, but I don't want to think of them as being determined either. So where is this semantic space between determination and randomness? I would submit to you that it's not there. It does not exist. Where it goes wrong is in our understanding of free will, is that what we mean by it is that free-willed choices are determined, but they are determined by things I identify with. So if my free-willed choices are determined by my tastes, my preferences, my feelings, then they are free. Well, they're not free at all. They are determined by your tastes and your preferences, your feelings. Materialism is associated with a lack of free will because it tells us that our choices are determined by neurophysiological activity, which we don't identify with from a first-person perspective. I don't think of myself as being my brain. I've never seen my brain, for that matter. And when a physicalist says your choices are determined by your brain, then we translate that automatically into my choices are not determined by something that I identify with. They are not determined by me. Therefore, my choices are not free. Now, of course, under idealism, you would say, well, the brain is just what your mental processes look like from an external perspective, from across a dissociative boundary. It's what your choices, your preferences, your tastes, it's what they look like when observed in the dashboard of another human being. So your choices are determined by your feelings, and your feelings just look like a brain and observed from a certain perspective. And then you would say, well, then I am free to will. And that would be largely true. But then I would go one step ahead and say, I don't choose my next thought. I don't choose what I fear. Otherwise, I would have no fears. I would choose to not fear anything. I don't choose how I feel. Otherwise, I would never be anxious. I would never be depressed. I would feel elated all the time. If I had free will, I would be the happiest person on earth living my entire life in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison because I would choose to love that above all else. But I can't. So I don't think we have free will in the sense that our mental inner life, including our choices, is determined by the ego. I think the ego is a little boat riding some very stormy seas in the middle of the Atlantic. And we like to think that the boat is going the direction we are rowing, but most of the times it's not. I think from the point of view of universal consciousness, necessity and free will boil down to the same thing. Universal consciousness will do what it does because it is what it is. The necessity is the will. It will what it does because it is what it is. Schopenhauer already said it. I am free to act according to my will, but not to will what I will. We are slaves of our will. So at a universal level, there is only universal consciousness. So its choices are never determined by something outside it because it's all that exists. But they are determined by what it is because it cannot not be what it is. It is what it is. And its activity will unfold according to certain universal archetypes that are what they are because universal mind is what it is. You see, so if you paid attention, you will see that sometimes I'm speaking as if free will exists, and sometimes I'm speaking as if it doesn't. And that's the point I'm trying to make. It's a red herring. If you understand what we mean by it, then the question doesn't even arise.
What do you think, Tom?
Oh, that's very interesting. I haven't been in that space before, but I can see how you get there. I have an entirely different notion of free will. I don't have the same notion. So we're talking about two different things here.
Sure.
Bernardo's free will and what I say call free will is different altogether. And in my world, free will is absolutely necessary, because what consciousness does, it makes choices. That's part of what defines consciousness, is awareness with a choice. Consciousness decides. And if you don't have free will, there are no choices. So for consciousness to exist, free will has to exist. For consciousness to exist, time has to exist. Because if there's choices, then there's before the choice and after the choice. So it implies time. So in any case, I define it quite differently. A lot of people define free will like it's you have a lamp and you rub it and a genie comes out. But instead of 3 wishes, you have an infinite number of wishes. That's free will. If I had free will, I'd be rich, I'd be sexy, I'd be young, I'd be living in a maximum security prison where everybody would leave me alone, whatever you have. If I had free will, I wouldn't get angry. Well, that's not, it's not a genie that will magically make all these things happen. That's not free will. Free will is the freedom to choose among the choices that you're aware of in your decision space. So you have a decision space. Now, you may be aware of, to make an example, you may be aware of 10 things in your decision space, 10 choices that you could have. Maybe you got some issue or some place you're trying to get. So you got 10 different choices you have around this thing. You have the free will to choose one of those 10 as to what you're going to do next, where you want to go or how you're going to get there or whatever. Now, there may be 50 choices that you could have, but you're only aware of those 10. So your free will is only to choose one of the 10 because that's all you know about. So as you evolve and you get rid of your fear and you get rid of your ego and your beliefs, your decision space grows. You get a bigger and bigger decision space. So evolving your consciousness also evolves your decision space. And we talked earlier, dogs and cats have smaller decision spaces than we do. So in my viewpoint, free will is the freedom to choose among the decisions that we know about or the choices that we know about in our decision space. Now, our decision space is limited. Okay, there's lots of choices that are outside of our decision space because we're not even aware of them. We don't consider them. So that's what free will is. It's a very limited thing. So yes, you can say, how do we make our choices? Well, it's because what the advertisers tell us. It's because what the politicians tell us. Well, it's because of what we read in books. And, we really don't have free will. All our choices are made because all these things that influence us. No, that's not my free will. That's something else. Free will to me is that there's choices you can make, and to not make a choice is one of those choices. So you have a decision space at any particular time. If you're a dog or cat, it's smaller. If you're a goldfish, it's smaller yet. If you're a human, you have a lot of choices, and you can pick one of those choices that you know of that's in your decision space. And you have the free will to do that. And free will is absolutely necessary. Otherwise, there is no choice. And if you say there is no choice, then you'd have to say the consciousness is irrelevant. There is no consciousness either. Now, that's the idea of we start with this, this Big Bang you were talking about, you see, and okay, it starts and we have the physics and we know how all the particles affect all the particles. And from now on, we're going to know everything that'll happen, except that's just a simulation. It's not a physical Big Bang, it's a simulated Big Bang. And the players have the choice. not the avatars. Avatars don't even exist. They're just information in the computer. The consciousness can make the choice, because that consciousness says, well, I can make my avatar do 5 different things. It can run, it can dance, it can cry, it can jump up and down. Those are the things that I know it could do. So I get to pick one. And the player does. It picks one. And the computer shows that elf jumping up and down because that's the one that was picked. And it computes all the consequences of that elf jumping up and down in a multiplayer game because of what else was going on. So that's my definition of free will. It's absolutely necessary, and it's a property of consciousness. In my mind, you have 2 opposite ends of the philosophical world, and one of them says that consciousness exists, therefore time exists, and therefore free will exists, because we have consciousness makes choice. It's awareness with a choice. The opposite to that is that, or the antithesis to that, is that you have materialism and determinism. And if you're a materialist, then you have to be a determinist, because the materialism is basically the clockwork universe. Like we said, once you know where all the particles are going. So those two are incompatible with each other. You can't be a materialist and also think that there's a thing called consciousness or time or free will. They're incompatible. So I'm in that group that says consciousness exists and free will and time are all fundamental things. And yes, in the simulation has to do with the rule set. Everything depends on the rule set, except you have players making choices, and the players change things. The players make a hydrogen bomb and set it off someplace. Changes a lot of stuff. Okay, things aren't the same anymore. So you don't just, because you have a rule set, know what's going to happen, because the players are making choices and they do things with their free will that affects the end result. Now, our virtual reality is not computed. It sounds like I'm saying that our virtual reality is computed from the ground up, from particles up. It's not. Our simulation is a probabilistic simulation. It's a probabilistic simulation computed from the top down, because that makes good computer sense, particularly when you have a rule set that can give you accurate probability distributions. But the whole thing is computed from top-down probability. That's why particles necessarily have to be probability distributions, because that's what they are. That's behind the curtain. That's what particles are. They're probability distributions. What happens next is a random draw from a probability distribution of the possibilities. So that's my sense. That's my take on free will. Yes, free will is a necessary part of consciousness, because choice is a necessary part of consciousness. Without choice, consciousness doesn't exist. It's awareness with choice.
If you want to reply to that, Bernardo.
Very briefly, not a reply, a comment. Tom has defined free will as the property that is required to traverse a decision space. And his story is coherent and consistent based on that definition. I don't think that's what most people mean by free will, but I understand how you're thinking of it. And your thinking is, of course, coherent given this. What I thought more interesting was that you established a relationship of necessity between consciousness, free will, and time. Time, I think, is problematic. I don't think it's required for consciousness, probably not even for free will insofar as it exists. But the status of time today is very iffy. Historically, we know that time is impossible to define without circularity. Wasn't it Augustine who said, if you ask me what time is, I know, but if I have to tell you who asks what time is, then I know not. It's very difficult to define what time is without referring to time itself. You say, well, time is the interval between 2 events. Well, interval is just another word for time. But more recently, because of this nebulous definition. Physicists have attempted to eliminate time from physics, and one arguably succeeded. Julian Barbour, in his book The End of Time, 20 years ago, I think. If he didn't succeed fully, at least it was a very, very decent attempt. It got the attention of a lot of people in the mainstream. More recently, now we do have mainstream physicists who say the opposite. Lee Smolin is right on your camp. He says space doesn't exist, time does. But the mainstream now is moving away from M theory or superstring theory and into loop quantum gravity, and their time goes out of the window. Time is no longer an irreducible physical quantity. It is now reducible to underlying microscopic quantum level processes. So it's an emergent thing. It's not an objective scaffolding of reality. I don't think that contradicts idealism at all. I think consciousness can exist outside time as a database of fundamental cognitive associations. They all exist at once, and time is just a traversal of that database. It's a partial view of the database. There is that metaphor by Alan Watts when he tried to dismiss the concept of causality. He says, we are in the position of a yogi sitting in front of a fence, and there is a tiny vertical slit on the fence, and we can see through that slit what happens on the other side. And on the other side, a cat walks by, and we first see the head of the cat, and then we see the tail of the cat. And every time the cat walks by, first we see the head, and then we see the tail. So the yogi would say, well, the head causes the tail. Why would the yogi say that? I mean, he would be right. The yogi would say that because he only has a partial view of a pattern that exists all at once or outside time, and that's the cat. I think mind can exist all at once with its own intrinsic cognitive associations, its own database of cognitive associations all at once. And what we call causality is just seeing that pattern through a slit and saying the head causes the tail.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. Now, I can define time in our physical universe because, in my view, the physical universe is a simulation being computed in consciousness, and time is just the outer loop. When you produce a simulation, if it's dynamic, the outer loop always has to have a time element on it. So you calculate everything now, then time goes ahead 1 delta t, you calculate everything again, and so on. So our time in this virtual reality is the delta t that is in the loop of the rendering engine that moves it forward delta t at a time. So that's what time is. But I think that you do need time for consciousness, because consciousness is choice. You need choice for consciousness. Choice is a before the choice and after the choice. For choice to have any meaning whatsoever, there has to be, before and after a choice. Well, you can't make it. If there's no time, there's no choice. If there's no choice, then consciousness does nothing. If consciousness does nothing because it doesn't make choices, a choice to communicate, a choice to be aware of this or be aware of that, then there's nothing. So to me, if you don't have time, free will, and consciousness, basically you end up with nothing. You end up with the grand zero. Nothing happens, nothing changes, nothing grows, nothing evolves, nothing learns. There is no point, there is no purpose, there is no reason. And to me, there's an awful lot to do about nothing if there is no point, purpose, or reason. So that's really why I end up where I do.
If I may comment on that, John, this is rich territory. We are now circling some key areas. First, I'll say something objectively, and then I will confess to being vulnerable to the very trap I'm going to describe. I think if philosophy is the love of wisdom. If our love is truth, then whatever truth is, we have to bite the bullet. And if it's full of meaning and rich, great. If it's nihilistic, then that's what it is. And my commitment, I like to think, is to truth. Now, of course, I'm also a human being living a life and needing meaning. And I like the notion that idealism provides meaning to life. I think it's important. There are many other negative aspects to idealism. I was more comfortable as an unthinking materialist, to be honest with you. I think there is less anxiety, there is less pressure, there is less responsibility, and it felt much lighter. The unbearable lightness of being, a la Milan Kundera, that's materialism, is the unbearable lightness of being. But I think there is meaning in idealism. But the impression, I understand your notion of time. It's the clock tick of the computer running the simulation.
Mm-hmm.
If the clock signal doesn't tick, then the states don't change and nothing's simulated. Maybe, and I don't want to go too far in saying that that's the case, but I would just raise the hypothesis. Maybe there is a risk you take the metaphor too far. Ultimately, we are talking about mind, not a simulation on a computer. So the metaphor serves its purpose well until a certain point, but if you keep on stretching it beyond that point, it may bring you to dangerous, shaky territory. If I can be arrogant enough as to suggest that time is that dangerous territory, that the notion that states need to change, that you need a clock, otherwise there is no meaning, I don't see that. I think what we call meaning and purpose and choice are not ultimate realities. They are penultimate realities. In other words, they are projections in the time dimension of something that is outside time, and therefore it's not a purpose, it's not a meaning, but it does exist. That reality, that purpose and meaning in the dimension of time are pointing to, that reality exists, even though it's not exactly what we call purpose and meaning. It's like the shadow of a cylinder. It will look like a rectangle or a circle. Neither is a cylinder, but both are pointing to the real reality of a cylinder. So I don't think to speak of purpose and meaning is invalid. I think it's fully valid. They are pointers to something in nature that truly exists and is important. They give us a sort of intuitive hook to something that is not rationally comprehensible because the intellect requires extension. It requires less extension in space and time. They are pointing to something that is real. But that real thing is not a purpose in the same sense that the shadow of a cylinder is not a cylinder. So I take purpose very seriously, but I don't think it exists as we think that it does. It's a projection from a reality that is inconceivable from our intellectual standpoint. So the best we can do is to say, we take it seriously because it is pointing at something that does exist. Meaning does exist in this sense, that what we call meaning does point at something that really exists, but it is outside time, and therefore shouldn't be thought of as a purpose to be achieved in the future. It is revealing something important and meaningful about what mind is, about those cognitive associations that exist without extension, that do not require extension to exist, associations of meaning, so to say.
Let's go ahead and with the last question here. It's about a future paradigm shift. It seems to me, as someone who's not a scientist, that there is some evidence to suggest that maybe materialism is wrong. You guys are on board. David Chalmers seems to be at least partially on board. There are some, but mainstream physics and science seems to be more materialistic. And I'm curious, Bernardo, we've talked about how paradigms take a long time to change. Something can be looking you right in the face and you'll deny it for a long time. What do you think about the future? Will idealism become like a mainstream metaphysical position and with science and everything, or do you think that we're a long way out from something like that?
No, it's happening already. It takes long. Historically, these things take long. You have to face the attempt to construct epicycles from the Ptolemaic crowd before you accept that the sun is the center of the solar system. So you go through this period of accumulating anomalies, very precarious attempt to fix the current model in order to accommodate the anomalies, until the realization comes that there is no way we can do that. We just have to abandon the current model because the anomalies are too overwhelming. And we are in the process of seeing that happen. The fact that non-contextuality, or to speak normal language, the fact that it is experimentally confirmed that physical properties do not have standalone existence, that alone completely defeats materialism, because materialism is based on the assumption that the one thing that has standalone existence are physical entities. When experiments over the past 40 over years show you having closed all the loopholes, the plausible ones and the totally implausible ones, all of them have been closed. When it shows you that that is not what's happening, physical entities and properties do not have standalone reality. There is only so far you can hand-wave your way out of concluding that we have to change our metaphysics. And what's being done now is bizarre. And I will say this with respect. um, I'm vulnerable to bizarre twists of mind as well, I'm sure. But you see people that accept what the experiments are saying, like Carlo Rovelli, um, who puts forward relational quantum mechanics. He accepts what the experiments are saying. All physical entities are relational. They are relative. They do not have standalone existence. But then he goes further and says, well, therefore, there exists nothing. Because, to say that the world is physical, although all physical quantities are relational, is to say that there is only movement, but nothing that moves. It's incoherent to say that there is only movement, but nothing that moves. Because movement, for it to have any sense, it requires something that is itself not movement, and which in turn moves. So to say that the world is relational requires an underlying level of reality that is itself not relational, and which grounds the meaning of those relationships that we call physical quantities. Rovelli does not do that. He refuses to acknowledge that lower level of reality. What does he do instead? He appeals to Nagarjuna and 3rd or 4th century Buddhism and says, there is nothing. It's turtles all the way down. It's relations all the way down. He's on record saying that, answering my question, saying that, well, I do think it's turtles all the way down. I asked the question tongue in cheek. You're saying, no, it's turtles all the way down. That's the fallacy of infinite regress. And he says, well, that's what I think is happening. That's a fantastic attempt to create an epicycle here and save Ptolemaic astronomy. Another equally fantastic attempt, maybe more fantastic, is Sean Carroll saying that, well, the correlations between the two quantum measurements of two entangled particles separated beyond the speed of light limit and all those nice entanglement experiments, that happens because there are gazillions of new real physical universes arising every fraction of a femtosecond, and we so happen to be in the one where those correlations happen. So you have to postulate a practical infinitude of real physical universes popping every infinitesimal fraction of a femtosecond to account for the data. I submit to you that this is the most implausible hypothesis conceivable to human thought. There is nothing more implausible than this. And as a detail aside, there is absolutely zero empirical evidence for the existence of these other physical universes popping up every fraction of a femtosecond. So these are the death throes of materialism. We are witnessing it now. It's when it starts entering the scope of the ridiculous, of the preposterous. And when the preposterous is suffixed by the letters PhD, then you know it's happening. It's happening right now. And 100 years from now, government institutions and education institutions will be granting scholarships for the study of 20th and early 21st century psychology. How could those people think that stuff? How could they ever entertain the hypothesis of materialism seriously? Because, mind you, historically, the originators of materialism were aware of the limitations. Denis Diderot, one of the two authors of La Encyclopédie, the founding document of the Enlightenment, is on record saying, materialism doesn't really work, but we need it to combat the church. I mean, this was survival at the time. People didn't want to be burned at the stake like Bruno was. So they needed to carve out some artificial space, ontic space for themselves and give some space for the church so they wouldn't die. But at some point in the second half of the 19th century, this general psychosis took over. And we started believing in materialism. Literally, there will be scholarships granted for the study of human psychology at this point in time. You will see.
Go ahead, Tom. Take us out.
Well,
what do you think for the future of idealism?
Well, I've just got 1 minute before I have another
Sure.
thing I have to be at.
Sure.
And I agree with everything Bernardo said. Yes, but I don't know that I have time to add much to it. But I would say that what he's describing, this craziness that's going on in science, coming up with these absolutely absurd ideas, is the same thing you get with any group of believers. When people generate reality out of belief, then that's what you get. I mean, you can argue with believers, what do we call them? True believers. And rationality has nothing to do with it. It's just nothing to do with it at all. They have to come up with an answer. Well, what is it? And they don't have an answer. So they just make something up that feels warm and fuzzy. And what feels warm and fuzzy to them is materialism, because that's the only, teddy bear they've ever had. And they are just going to hang on to that teddy bear no matter what. But he's right. It means that we are on the cusp of change. And I think in the next 2 or 3 decades, we are probably going to see some big changes in that way, certainly in the next century. I don't think it's going to be that long. The rope is frayed, it's hanging by a thread, and that thread is totally irrational, and it's going to break sooner or later. Now, the problem is that if we don't have any new paradigms in place, any good theories to explain, the quantum physics, to explain why C is a constant, to explain the paranormal, if we don't have any good theories, then what we'll have is a vacuum. A power vacuum, and there'll be a mad rush for people to own whatever it is that's in charge. It's not going to be a pretty sight. So I'm hoping we will come up with something. I think that idealism is the correct answer. I think that the virtual reality is the correct answer. But I'd be happy with any answer that works well, that turns this corner into a little more peace and gentleness and kindness between people. Any answer that heads us in that direction, I'm all in favor of it, whatever it is. But yes, we're going to see a major overturning of paradigm. We're going to see a major thrashing about in probably the near future. And it's going to be bigger than all the paradigm shifts that we've seen so far multiplied by 100. This is going to be the big one. And it'll take some time to work out. But it's happening, and it's happening now.